Imagine trying to run a modern industrial economy when like 5 million of your most vital workers just vanish.
Right, just completely gone from the labor pool.
Yeah. Welders, logistics experts, heavy machinery operators, just gone. And that is the mathematical and, well, physical reality facing the Russian war machine in early 2026.
It's a staggering deficit to try and manage.
It really is. So welcome to this session of Sip and Talk. We are doing a massive deep dive into the sources today. We've got this huge stack of economic reports, intelligence briefings, global market analyses right in front of us.
Lots of data to get through.
Tons of data. And our mission today is to basically open up the hood and analyze this really complex financial engine driving the conflict. We're going to unpack this strategy called starving the wolf, which is this brutal war of attrition.
Right.
And then we need to trace the ripple effects of that strategy across the globe, specifically looking at the Crank Alliance.
So that's China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran.
Exactly. We're looking at how feeding this wolf fundamentally alters the security landscape, especially for Taiwan. But real quick, just a crucial note for you, our listener, before we really get into the gears of this machine.
Ground rules are important.
Yeah, 2 big rules for this Sip and Talk. First, all the financial data and budget numbers we discussed today, it's purely for reference. This does not constitute investment advice.
Definitely not.
And second, this deep dive is just an objective analysis of geopolitical realities.
Yeah.
We are just calling balls and strikes based entirely on the sources. Absolutely no discrimination, malice, or criticism against any nation or group of people is intended.
Which is so critical. I mean, critical thinking requires analyzing the board exactly as it exists in reality, completely devoid of ideological bias.
Right.
If we want to understand how a global flashpoint sustains itself, we just have to follow the money no matter how uncomfortable the destination is.
Yeah, exactly. So to start us off, think of the current state of Russia's economy like this high-performance sports car, right? It's roaring down the highway at 100 miles an hour.
Okay, I like that analogy.
But suddenly the driver realizes the gas tank is flashing empty, and they can't stop. They refuse to stop. So they desperately switch the whole machine into this highly restrictive eco mode just to keep the engine from stalling out completely.
But the engine is already sputtering.
It's totally sputtering. We are seeing that classic economic dilemma of, buying cannons instead of butter.
Yeah.
To keep the war machine funded, the government is essentially just siphoning capital straight out of the civilian sector.
Right, which hits the everyday person immediately.
Oh, absolutely. The cost of basic goods, eggs, butter, daily necessities, it's skyrocketed. And this new 2026 budget plan is the perfect example of this eco mode. They are hiking the value-added tax, the VAT, from 20% to 22%.
Which, a 2% jump might not sound massive on paper.
Right, but a VAT is a consumption tax. It hits every single stage of the supply chain. It's basically drawing blood from everyday consumers and the oligarchs to fill this massive budget gap.
$100 billion budget gap. They are extracting all of that liquidity because the external revenue streams are just drying up. We can see this super clearly in the early 2026 data from CPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute.
And what are the numbers showing?
Well, for the first time since the escalation of the conflict, Russia's defense budget has actually been mathematically forced downward. It's been revised to 14.9 trillion rubles for 2026.
Wait, down from that?
Down from 16 trillion rubles in 2025.
Oh, wow. So 14.9 trillion, that's what, about 6.3% of their GDP?
Exactly. And the drop tells us that this isn't some diplomatic pivot, right? It's a fiscal wall. The Treasury just simply cannot print or extract the rubles fast enough to sustain that 2025 burn rate.
So they're just running out of gas.
They are trapped in what macroeconomic analysts call the impossible triangle.
The impossible triangle.
Yeah, it's essentially a war economy variation of the Mundell-Fleming trilemma. So in this scenario, the central bank has 3 competing goals. Point 1, you have to maintain hyper-elevated war expenditures to sustain the front line.
Right.
Point 2, you need low inflation, so your domestic currency doesn't just collapse into hyperinflation. And point 3, you require baseline social stability.
Meaning, the population can still afford groceries without rioting in the streets.
Exactly. And the mechanical rule of a trilemma is that you can only ever achieve 2 of those 3 points at the same time. You can't print money to fund the war, keep prices low, and keep everyone happy simultaneously.
Something has to break.
And the breaking point right now is civilian economic growth. To prevent hyperinflation from destroying the ruble, the Bank of Russia has been forced to hold interest rates at a suffocating 14.5% as of April 2026.
Geez, 14.5%. I mean, I know that's down from the peak of 21% a couple of years ago, but 14.5 is still a severe fever for any economy.
It's catastrophic for civilian enterprise.
Right, like if you're a civilian bakery owner or just a local manufacturer, a 14.5 baseline interest rate means your cost of capital is basically prohibitive. You can't take out a loan to, I don't know, repair a delivery truck or buy new ovens.
The civilian economy just freezes in place so they can subsidize the military economy.
And the main artery that usually funds this whole system, their energy experts, is visibly constricting too. Like the Kiev School of Economics reported that Russian oil export revenues dropped below $10 billion in February 2026.
Which is a wartime low.
That's incredible.
Yeah, and when the primary revenue stream dips below that $10 billion psychological and fiscal threshold, the state basically has to start eating its own seed corn to survive.
Which brings us to the core logic behind this starving the wolf strategy, right?
Yeah.
The West's attempt to force an end to the conflict through systemic attrition. But looking at the numbers, I really have to question the mechanics here. Well, is this just a massive geopolitical staring contest? Like a game of chicken? There's this old Silicon Valley adage, if you find yourself in a hole, stop digging.
Right.
But instead of stopping, it seems like the state is just trying to dig its way out with an even more expensive shovel. Buying time with these VAT hikes and the 14.5% interest rates, can an economy this size actually be starved? Or are they just going to adapt?
Well, the mechanism of starving the wolf isn't really designed to force an immediate, white flag surrender on the battlefield. It's designed to induce systemic collapse, irreversible muscle atrophy across the entire industrial base.
Oh, okay.
Let's go back to that human capital deficit you mentioned at the start. The Financial Times recently corroborated that labor shortage of roughly 5 million people across the Russian economy.
5 million people.
Yeah, and that is what systemic collapse looks like in practice. When a state mobilizes hundreds of thousands of specialized workers, mechanics, software engineers, logistics coordinators, and sends them to a trench, the domestic production lines that rely on that knowledge just stop.
Right, and it's not just the workforce. It's the physical hardware decaying, too.
Yeah.
Going back to the car metaphor, it's like trying to keep that sports car running at 100 miles an hour, but you are never allowed to change the oil or replace the spark plugs.
Eventually, the friction destroys the engine block.
Exactly.
And we have a Bloomberg economics analysis that details the severe technical decay in two super specialized sectors, civil aviation and oil extraction.
What's happening there?
Well, because of secondary sanctions, their industrial base is largely cut off from high-end Western microchips, precision sensors, telemetry equipment. Pumping oil out of the Siberian tundra isn't a low-tech job anymore.
No, it takes serious precision tech.
Right. It requires real-time data sensors and advanced drill bits. Without those parts, well, efficiency just plummets. And in aviation, they are literally cannibalizing commercial fleets for spare parts.
Meaning they're grounding perfectly good airplanes just to strip the avionics and the landing gear, just to keep a smaller fraction of the fleet flying.
Exactly. It's this invisible compound in wear and tear from prolonged isolation. And to cover the massive gaps caused by this inefficiency, the state has been draining the National Wealth Fund.
The NWF.
Yeah, and this fund isn't just a checking account, it's their sovereign piggy bank, built over decades of surplus energy exports. It's held in liquid assets like gold and foreign currency. But our sources show the liquidity of that fund has already been halved.
Halved? Wow.
They're burning through their economic safety net just to maintain baseline operations.
Okay, but if the friction is that severe, right? If the wealth fund is halved, inflation is crushing civilian purchasing power, and 5 million workers are just missing, you have to ask, why doesn't the internal pressure cause the system to buckle?
That is the big question.
Like, why hasn't the populace turned against the immense cost of this war? The 2025 budget alone ran a 5.6 trillion ruble deficit.
Well, to understand why there's no internal rupture, we really have to examine the psychology of the siege mentality.
The cognitive shell.
Exactly. Polling data from The Economist and The Washington Post shows how autocracies manage this severe economic degradation. In a highly controlled information space, justice and prosperity get redefined as mere survival.
Wow.
The Latvian Intelligence Bureau, the SAB, released an incredibly detailed report in April 2026 outlining how this works. The state propaganda machine doesn't actually hide the economic pain. They just beautifully reframe it.
Right, they don't pretend the grocery shelves are full. They just change the narrative about why the shelves are empty.
Yeah.
It's honestly like a schoolyard bully who throws the first punch.
Right.
But then runs to the teacher, claiming they only did it because they felt isolated and disrespected.
That's a great way to put it.
How does a nation being economically starved still believe they are the righteous heroes? It mirrors those isolation tactics you see in high-control cults. The leader creates extreme external pressure, and instead of rebelling, the group just bonds tighter against the perceived outside threat.
That is the exact mechanism. The SAB report shows how that 5.6 trillion ruble deficit is packaged and sold to the public, not as a failure of leadership, but as a, quote, necessary cost for national sovereignty.
Unbelievable.
The narrative is that the West is attempting an economic slaughter of the Russian people. And so enduring poverty becomes an act of profound patriotism.
So the cognitive loop is just entirely closed. Physical poverty doesn't lead to internal reflection or protesting the government. It actually deepens their hatred for the West, because the West is blamed for the sanctions causing the poverty in the first place.
Yes. Historically, when a population's standard of living collapses, it is psychologically much easier to blame a faceless external enemy than to accept that your own leadership made a catastrophic error.
It's a terrifyingly effective defense mechanism.
It is. The data suggests that true cognitive shifts in these environments almost never happen incrementally. The system maintains its rigid psychological shell until a total structural collapse basically forces a reckoning.
Right. But, no nation exists in a total vacuum. And if the West's strategy is to starve this wolf, we have to look at the enablers who are actively sneaking its snacks over the fence.
The Crink Alliance.
Yes. This is where China and North Korea change the math entirely. And it frustrates me, honestly, because it's such a diplomatic contradiction.
Yeah.
On paper, Beijing maintains this stance of strict neutrality.
Right.
Yet the customs data shows this massive continuous influx of microchips and heavy off-road vehicles heading directly from Chinese manufacturers to the front lines. I mean, claiming to be a neutral trading partner is just terrible acting at this point. It's not one starving wolf anymore. It's a cluster of piranhas that swarm together.
Well, I wouldn't call it terrible acting. I'd call it calculated strategic ambiguity.
Just strategic ambiguity.
Yeah. The objective for Beijing isn't to convince the West of its pure innocence. The objective is just to exploit the loopholes in international trade law enough to avoid fatal secondary sanctions on its own banking sector.
Just playing dumb enough to get by.
Exactly. Let's look at the data from a CEPA report, the Center for European Policy Analysis, from April 2026. It confirms that China currently provides over 80% of Russia's dual-use goods.
And to be clear for you listening, when we say dual use, we aren't talking about basic consumer electronics like iPhones. We are talking about highly specific components.
Field programmable gate arrays, optical sensors.
Yeah, specialized microcontrollers. Parts that are nominally shipped for civilian telecommunications, but are immediately stripped and integrated into drone guidance systems and ballistic missiles.
Which provides plausible deniability. The paperwork says civilian telecom, but the reality on the ground is military resupply.
Right.
Meanwhile, North Korea just bypasses the ambiguity entirely. They've directly provided millions of artillery shells. And what's deeply concerning is that these logistics networks are becoming permanent infrastructure.
Like the bridge.
Yes. As recently as April 2026, Russia and North Korea actually celebrated the opening of a new high-capacity highway bridge over the Tumen River.
And, you don't build a massive concrete bridge for temporary smuggling. You build a bridge to establish a permanent, sanction-free logistics hub that Western naval monitors cannot interdict.
That overland route is critical, and it works right in tandem with their maritime evasion strategies.
Yeah.
Our sources are heavily tracking Russia's shadow fleet, which is now estimated at roughly 2,000 vessels.
Let's break down the mechanics of a shadow fleet for the listener, because it's fascinating. It's not just a bunch of pirate ships flying black flags, right?
No, not quite.
These are aging oil tankers that use dark AIs. They literally turn off their automated tracking transponders in the middle of the ocean. And then they conduct these crazy ship-to-ship transfers, pumping millions of barrels of crude oil from a Russian vessel into an ostensibly neutral vessel right in international waters.
Which blends the sanctioned oil with non-sanctioned oil.
Exactly. It completely obscures its origin before it even arrives at a port in Asia.
It is a massive decentralized evasion network. By combining the dark fleets, the Tumen River Bridge, and the dual-use supply chains from China, these nations aren't just doing opportunistic trade. They are systematically constructing a self-sustaining geopolitical shelter designed to weather Western sanctions.
Which brings us to the boomerang effect. Because why should a listener care about a bridge over the Tumen River or an optical sensor from Shenzhen? Because feeding this wolf has direct destabilizing implications for Taiwan.
Absolutely.
But let me ask you a pushback question here. China's domestic export economy is struggling, right? They've got heavy tariffs, a domestic real estate slump.
Yes, significant economic headwinds.
So if Beijing is financially draining its own resources to keep Russia alive, doesn't that massive expenditure actually reduce the threat to Taiwan? Like, if China's economically overextended, launching a highly complex amphibious assault becomes financially prohibitive, do they just lash out harder, or are they too broke to fight?
It's a really logical assumption, but it ignores the underlying barter system happening beneath the surface. Analysts refer to this as the linked threat.
The linked threat?
Yeah. Yes, Beijing assumes a heavy economic burden by sustaining Russia. However, the geopolitical trade-off is known as technology for resources. Russia does not have the liquid currency to pay for this lifeline, so they are paying with their most closely guarded, top-tier military secrets.
Oh, wow. We are talking about proprietary military technology that Moscow historically refused to export even to its allies, right? Just to maintain their own edge.
Precisely. But because of their sheer desperation, Russia is transferring the absolute crown jewels of its defense industry to Beijing.
What kind of tech?
Well, we're seeing data indicating transfers of advanced upgrades to the S-400 missile defense system, highly classified quieting technology for nuclear submarines, and next-generation anti-ship missile schematics.
And these aren't the downgraded export models.
No, this is the core intellectual property. Furthermore, the transfer goes beyond just hardware into modern tactical doctrine. A comprehensive piece in the Eurasia Review highlighted that Russian combat experience, specifically what electronic warfare works against Western precision weapons and what fails, is directly shaping the modern playbook of the People's Liberation Army.
So the Russian military is essentially acting as a massive real-world testing ground and feeding all that tactical data straight back to Chinese command centers.
It is highly tangible. The integration of this technology recently culminated in joint Russian-Chinese naval and air drills in the West Pacific.
Simulating a Taiwan crisis.
Exactly. These were not standard readiness exercises. They were explicitly simulating anti-access and area denial operations, essentially practicing how to effectively block U.S. and allied naval forces from intervening during a hypothetical crisis in the Taiwan Strait.
That is terrifying.
So while the Chinese economy faces headwinds, the PLA's technological capabilities are taking a massive generational leap forward directly because of Russia's economic desperation.
So the West's attrition strategy physically weakens the Russian state. But the unintended consequence is that it forces Moscow into total dependency on Beijing, which fundamentally alters the balance of power in the Pacific. It's just a staggering chain reaction.
It really demonstrates that in a highly globalized system, you cannot isolate a conflict to a single region. The macroeconomic pressure applied in Eastern Europe acts as a direct catalyst for military modernization in East Asia.
We have unpacked an immense amount of complex machinery today. I mean, from this systemic friction of 14.5% interest rates to the evaporation of 5 million specialized workers, the psychological armor of the siege mentality, the shadow fleets, and now nuclear submarine tech.
It's a lot to synthesize.
It is. But as we synthesize all this data, we really have to pull the limbs back to the human element. Because behind every single line item in that 5.6 trillion ruble deficit, behind the VAT hikes and the supply chain maneuvers, the most tragic reality is the unquantifiable loss of human life. We analyze the fiscal data and the geopolitical strategies because it's vital to understand the mechanisms shaping our world. But the ultimate hope, the real reason we track the depletion of the World Fund and falling oil revenues, is the understanding that when the financial engine of a war machine finally runs dry, it forces an end to the violence.
The structural data only matters because it dictates the timeline of human suffering. And as we look toward the remainder of 2026, that leaves us with a critical, lingering question for you to ponder.
What's that?
as these regimes continue to package extreme economic degradation at the glorious patriotic sacrifice, can that closed psychological loop truly survive the compounding friction of another harsh winter? Or when the liquid reserves hit absolute zero and the domestic pressure finally fractures that cognitive shell, will the Crink Alliance turn its fangs inward on itself before it can project further instability onto the outside world?
That is exactly the friction point we'll be watching so closely in the months ahead. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the sources today. If you value this kind of objective, mechanistic breakdown of global events, please make sure to hit that subscribe button for Sip and Talk so you never miss a conversation.
We aim to cut through the noise.
Exactly. Explain the why and the how behind all the headlines. And, on a lighter note, after such a heavy, intense geopolitical discussion, we all need to decompress a bit. I highly encourage you to go check out our old friend Mickey's latest travel vlog on YouTube.
It is a fantastic palate cleanser.
It really is. The geopolitical map is heavy, but there is still a massive amount of beauty, culture, and humanity out there to explore. So go check that out. Until next time, keep your eyes open, keep challenging the narratives, and we'll see you on the next deep dive. Take care.